And the next thing to do is to sew it to your tree skirt. I know that there are some projects, or some of us, and I've done this many times, where you can sew the binding to the back and then finish it by machine on the front. I recommend on this project that you go ahead and sew it to the front and finish it by hand on the back, or do the stitch in the ditch finishing to finish it by machine, just because it's easier to attach the binding and then be able to come back with your leftover binding, because the extra binding is what we're going to use to make our ties. So I'm going to be attaching the binding to the front of my quilt, and then I will take care of the ties, and then I will be finishing it. I'm not going to demonstrate how to do the entire quilt, but I will show you a few key points. So to begin your binding, I have several inches there that are not attached, so I can finish it in a minute. I'm starting in the point I'm starting at just so that I can show you a few of the curves to begin with. So I'm going to carefully sew my binding with a careful 1/4 inch seam. And when I get to this point, I went a tiny bit too far. When I get right to the point of the tip of my star, this is why we have it. I'm just going to kind of stretch that binding around the curve. I lifted my needle in case it helps you see it. I don't know if you can, but you just kind of stretch that there. Actually, what I lifted my needle for was to pivot, sorry. So pivot that, and then I'm going to sew all the way to the corner. Now my next angle is a 90-degree angle. So I'm going to handle that like I would the corner of any quilt, and I'm going to pivot that up so that I can sew my corner. It's unfortunate that it's coming on a seam, but that's okay. Turn and put my needle back down and continue on. So now I am headed up the straight seam that leads me to the center of the star and where the hole is in the middle of the quilt. So this straight edge will go up. I'll be trimming that later. Okay, so now I've got my needle down, and I'm right at that point. If I lift it up, that you can see I'm right on that 1/4 inch line there. I like to, on this one, I like to back stitch a couple so I can lift up my needle, and I do like to pivot on this one a little bit, but instead of doing like a 90-degree, I just kind of do a tiny bit, because this is a little bit more of an angle. Turn it and put my needle back down. But now, going around this edge, you're just going to keep your binding in place. You're just going to sew from one point to the next. Keep the needle in, stretch the bias binding, and rotate your fabric, and again to the next point. Needle down, rotate, and go again. So you just continue like this, moving around the inner kind of circle of that star. It's more of an octagon, but we're treating it like a circle in our sewing. So just needle down and kind of rotate as you go around until you get through all 8 of those diamonds. And this is where it's just so helpful to have the binding that stretches so easily, and it will be the same when you're sewing it down on the back. So we're almost there. Now if you want to, you can do the same thing. You don't have to do what I did with the pivot. You can just do that. Pull the fabric, put your needle back down, and there we go. So here I am now going back down the other side. Here we are. I continued sewing my binding all the way around, and so you can see that on the outside edges it's ready to be turned over and sewed down. It's going to look beautiful on the little corner points. When you do that, you'll reach that and you'll pull the other side over, and you'll have a tiny little pucker right there that you'll just pick up with a single stitch in your binding when you're sewing it down to the back. So you're going to go all the way around your quilt that way. You'll be able to just flip that like you would a normal corner. And here you should be able to just stretch it all the way around, and the fabric should stretch beautifully. So I've got mine sewn all the way around. We've got it around that center circle. You can see there that it's going to be great. The binding will go all the way around and it's going to be beautiful. So the last thing I'm going to do with the machine before I pick up a needle and thread and spend some time hand stitching mine to the back is I'm going to add the ties. With the leftover binding, you're going to first start out by taking that diagonal edge and cutting that off so that you have two straight edges on both ends. So this is one long piece. As you can see here, you're going to have plenty. You're going to have a lot of fabric. I made this very generous so that you could decide how long you want your ties to be. You're going to want them to be at least 20 inches long at the very minimum. So when I cut at 20 inches, I've got a couple of seams near the end. So I'll probably go just a little bit farther and cut mine a few inches longer than that. Once I've cut my binding into two pieces that are equal in length that I'm going to use for the ties on my tree skirt, I'm going to do a little bit of ironing. I'm going to show you what I do. So first I iron in a length, a 1/4 inch. You would do this going all the way down the length of both sides of your strip that's going to be the tie, and then only on one end do I do this. Fold it in, press that as well. This is going to be how you're going to finish that strip of binding into a thinner, sturdy tie that can be used. So then I'm going to just fold it in half, press, and I would do that going all the way down the length. Now I wouldn't bother with folding the end on the other one. So you can see on this binding strip that I have the ends folded under, I just did a top stitch over and all the way down. It's kind of curving a little bit because it's bias, and that's okay. You can just give it a good press when you're done. And then I sewed all the way down to the end, and this end is just a raw edge. I didn't do anything to that, and the reason is that one end is going to be sewn into the binding, and we don't need the extra bulk of more fabric inside your binding. So leave one end plain, and the other end needs to be finished like that, and you do that twice to make your ties. The last step with your sewing machine then is to sew the ties on. So I just laid one tie, and this is the one with the raw edge. You can see my finished edge is on the other end. I put it between 3/4 of an inch and an inch down. It's about, that's right in between. Just a little less than an inch down from my corner, and I laid it with the end facing the same raw edge as the edge of the inside edge of the quilt. And my binding's on the other side, and I laid it down and following the same seam. I know it's hard to see because of my backing fabric, but right across the exact seam line where I attached my binding, I just sewed across it. So now I have my tie attached, and when I sew my binding down, it will go right over it, and it will be finished right into the quilt. You can see how that looks on my original one. Here's the backing, here's my tie. It's finished right in. I just sewed my binding down over it. So when it comes together, I've got these two ties. They're at equal spaces, and these are 20 inches long, and you can see that it's plenty of length, a nice bow. I've got a lot left. So that's the final step. This is what it's going to look like after we've sewn the binding back down, going all the way around the edges. Here's my original one. I'll be working on mine, and I'll share it with you next week when it's done. And that's it. Thank you so much for participating in this sew along. I hope you've had a great experience. I hope you've learned a few things along the line, and I hope you have a great week.